next point in the program is our first guest presenter for you, which I'm very happy to introduce. Ben Cerveny is a very long time friend and collaborator. Ben was one of the key variables within whatever success the New Normal program had, and is currently directing a extraordinarily interesting project called the Foundation for Public Code, which Ben will tell you about in considerable detail, I'm sure. The project, as I see it in many ways, it will, for our discussion for planetary governance, will allow us to kind of locate this question not only in infrastructure, but in a particular kind of infrastructure that is the city, the infrastructure that we live in, that is our habitat, with which we're most directly, we most directly co-inhabit with each other. And for this, as I think Ben will make clear, the question of the role of the model, of how it is that governance is able to produce society is able to sense and make sense of itself through models, in which governance can actually use these as a way of providing for the public good, is seen as central, but not just, and I think this again, the key point, not just as something that governments do, but something that governance is. So with that, let me just give a little bit of the regular bio information on Ben Cerveny for those of you who are not familiar with this work. Ben has worked for 25 years or more as an executive and strategist, designer in the context of inventing new operating systems, media applications, web services, products, built environments, and digital games. He has had his fingers in the pie of the digital revolution, as your parents call it, for the last 25 years or so. Before Foundation for Public Code, he was a design fellow at Samsung, leading a long project on room scale programmable environments. Previously, he led the design of the massively multiplayer online game that eventually became Flickr, which he also named. He founded the Experience Design Lab at Frog Design. He was the CEO of Bloom Studios, whose data visualization iPad app Planetary was acquired by the Smithsonian Institution. Many other things that Ben has done that he's usually too modest to tell us about, but with the one that I hope he's not too modest to tell us about in considerable detail is the project he's working on now, which is the Foundation for Public Code, but the future of public code as such. So with that, let me hand it to Ben Cerveny.
Great. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for the introduction. Well, I don't know. I'll see how much considerable detail I can get to in the time that I have, but I'm happy to go there. Let's see if I can make this work. How do I actually play from here? It's kind of unclear. Oh, there we go. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, I'm sort of starting a little bit farther back than the current sort of focus of my practice at the Foundation for Public Code, because I think there are a couple of sort of phases that we need to move through as a society towards this concept of planetary governance. And I would say definitely the first phase that one needs to move through in any kind of activity is opening one's eyes. Awareness is the thing that we're most in need of in this process, because we don't really even understand what the materiality of planetary governance, what even are we talking about? What are we trying to affect in this process? And what we are trying to affect are models of systems that operate at scales that humans do not have senses designed to perceive. And so what we need to build first are cultural apparatuses that allow us to see these systems. Dynamic system models are actually the medium through which any process of something like governance is meted out. And therefore, it is first literacy in the way that those systems are currently operating that we need to build. And so for this process, we have looked at for many years, obviously, science particularly is focused on the exploration of dynamic system models and their understanding. And so science has built a variety of tools to help them understand this, and those mostly involve complicated mathematics and simulation. And both of those things, although very powerful, are inaccessible to the mind of the average everyday participant in society. But fortunately, more recently, we have evolved sort of a vehicle that encapsulates all of these kind of perceptual dynamic system understanding media, and we call that the video game. It turns out a lot of this potential to bring in dynamic system model knowledge is about inhabiting a space of interaction that involves all of these actors in simulation together, such that we can sort of build a dynamic sort of map in our head of how all these pieces fit together. And so first, I think we need to start to understand what the process of modeling looks like and how models work as a cultural medium and how we can use them as an anchor for conversations around activities like an attempt at planetary governance. But I think that really for people that move in the space of sort of understanding society, understanding technology, and understanding how those things need to relate to each other, the system model is key. And particularly what is most important about understanding the system model, it is dynamically moving through time. And that is really where this concept of infrastructure begins to extrude into a new format, which is infrastructure over time, which is pretty much the medium, as we heard in the previous presentation, that infrastructure is the construction of a decision space or a possibility space that is a calcification of a set of choices that come out of culture. And often, humans invent things all the time. The first 30 years, they call them technology. If they work, they begin to call them infrastructure, and the focal depth changes away from them. We hold them in the foreground while we're working out a sort of a set of cultural kind of interactions with the medium of technology, and then after we have metabolized them, they become infrastructure. And it is in that inflection point of the movement of technology into infrastructure that the most sort of work of this kind of social metabolization that happens, particularly in the city, takes place. And the city has always been, the city is one of the longest running processes that humans have created, and therefore it is, in that has become the most capable of taking on disruptive change, which technology almost always represents, and wrapping it in something that is really the real medium of how all this governance works, which is policy. And policy is the encoding of process into an infrastructure made of humans, essentially. And this is the core activity of governance, is the generation and implementation of policy. It turns out that what's happening as we go here is that there is another very large process that humans have instantiated, which is not as certainly even remotely as long-lived as the city, but has scaled to its beyond the city quite quickly, and that is network digital application design. And so right now, what we've sort of find ourselves at is this really strange moment in history where two graphs are crossing, which is the city's ability to be the sort of placeholder and sort of the platform for where all of this idea of policy and metabolic social process takes place. The line that's now crossing over that is that of software, and software's capability to do all those things. And so we find ourselves at this focal depth shift of being able to use as a medium for the meeting out of this type of self-reflexive activity, which is governance, network software, and global scale computation, planetary scale computation, are now becoming the foregrounded medium for this activity, rather than the policy that is emanating from urban centers and states. And so one of the things that we need to sort of begin to understand is how those things relate. And so what the activity at the foundation has been to help cities understand that they're, for many years, cities imagined their process as being something that, was related to technology through this very distant kind of pointer at something they called ICT or IT, which sat outside of their core function. And now they have slowly, especially, well, not so slowly in the era of the pandemic, we now see that the centering of the software process as a part of what this means for the sort of metabolic working through of governance has become core. And so one of the sort of tools that is, you know, emerging out of the relationship of the processes of policy production and maintenance around computational modeling is this idea that these models are the vehicle that is actually producing the city as an emanation, right? The models are rule spaces in and of themselves that have momentum, and they're moving forward in kind of almost a computational time of the execution of policy, in which the decision space for the citizens, which is a technology again that has existed long before computation, because you know the law actually already provides these, you know, these sort of decision spaces. So there is at any given moment of this dynamic system model that is moving forward through time, which is the relation of a society with its own policy and with its own sort of technical infrastructure. You can steer this model as a set of forking possibilities. So you need to have a superset of simulation space in front of you that begins to understand how this process can unfold, and you can make choices inside of that and make, you know, sort of propositions. So at the core of this is this kind of forking model of possibility spaces that, you know, almost like the trolley problem, except for in all different directions along all different axes all the time. And so, you know, one needs to build a vehicle that moves through this possibility space, which is about the implementation of policy. And this is, you know, becomes massively more difficult when you start to understand that you're in this nonlinear system that involves a huge number of actors that are all, you know, that don't have a framework of governance that formally operates around them. If you're talking about things like nation states, they're all moving on their own trajectories. And so the idea that what you need to do is build a rule space which helps them understand the operational affordances within the context of material flows of production and consumption, or, you know, the cycle of waste in their municipality. These types of things that relate to the actual planetary umwelt, like what all of the characteristics that they need to be mapping that go down below the model that they're working inside of. They need to be able to operate in the space that gives them these decisions in real time. And so, you know, what one sort of comes to as you begin to start to understand how software needs to fit together within the realm of public policy making and its implementation, right, which is actually how the production of society, you know, will work in a digitally transformed society, is that the models will be, you know, used as a decision space, and the decisions reached will be implementations in software that allow for things like urban planning, or the composition of work teams, you know, that in whatever kind of vehicles, whether they're corporations or purpose-built collaborations that go to try and solve problems within this larger space that we're trying to tend. Like all of these kind of mechanisms are going to be packages of software that have a tribe around them. This is the thing that's been really interesting about our work at the foundation, is that it turns out that software, when you make it open and transparent and adaptive, software is made of people, because software, much like a biological form in which the cells are replaced, you know, the biological form stays the same identity and the, you know, sort of substrate changes underneath it. Similarly, a code base is not the same over sort of the timescale of civilization. So instead, it is the sort of folk wisdom of the community and that process of the building of those tools that becomes the core. And so it is the relationship between the software's ability to communicate its own existence and its own needs and its own kind of future that then ties a community of practice together that spans multiple different, sort of slices of jurisdiction that we now call it. So if you have people in multiple municipalities or states that are sharing problem spaces that they have constructed large software applications to try and solve, those software applications become communities of practice and become disciplines, through their manifestation as functional software. They begin to invert this idea of the sort of tool and the user, and instead the users become almost acolytes of the sort of problem solution that the whole software is aimed at. And so the idea that you actually are kind of collaboratively steering, it's like being in a spaceship that is a huge collective project aimed at problem solving, and the people inside the spacecraft all have sort of roles that are about these, the maintenance of this software. And so what you sort of, as you accrete these tool sets that are built through kind of collaborations that involve groups that are not segmented by their sort of domain or politics, then you end up with this, with a substrate of the digital, which has a fecundity and a diversity to it, which actually, sort of settles into the soil of the natural system. Like, it is also made of parts that are decomposed out of old things that are then, taken up through the soil and remade into like new structures that have different capabilities. And so there is a whole ecosystem of, the production and destruction of digital megastructures that is part of the process that, in the same way that the city is, Amsterdam has been Amsterdam for thousands of years, regardless of whether the same structures have been here, because it's a not in organizational process that consumes and produces and destroys and consumes again, a lot of the materials that are part of its, sort of making it up. And so what I would say overall, that sort of the main word that is useful to transmit in this process is this idea of stewardship, which I believe is the sort of active verb of sustainability. The activity of making things sustainable is stewardship. And this is what we call our core activity at the Foundation for Public Code, is the stewardship of code bases that produce these applications that are aimed at solving planetary scale problems or urban scale problems, or societal, providing services to society. All of those code bases are, need to be replicated, transmitted, forked, changed, resubmitted. This kind of rhizomatic tangle of sort of function in this software domain needs people to tend it. And the tending of this chaotic and yet structured unfolding of the digital realm that needs to slowly layer itself like a mycelial network on top of the the sort of substrate of the material of urbanism and society is super important. So this is, I would say, kind of the core philosophical direction of the foundation, is to provide a sort of guide to the activity of stewardship in digital infrastructure. How does one, make a viable digital ecosystem of all of these products that are all interrelated to each other in, more and more complex superstructures, but with sort of these social trajectories and forces that are inhabiting their continued production and sustainability. And I think I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say, but I think that's the slice that you get today.
Great, thank you, Ben. It's always great to join Ben from his houseboat in Amsterdam. It looks like I was always wanting to sit down next to him and have a drink. We have a couple. I wanted to entertain a couple, as an invitation to entertain a couple questions from the chat. First of all, I wonder if I could ask the Strelka team to post the links doc that we've prepared which I'll speak to in a moment. We've prepared a sort of a list of a lot of relevant links for the work of our presenters about the Berggruen Institute, about Strelka, about all this stuff. You can download books. You can look at a lot of articles and great stuff. But we had one question in the chat that seemed particularly salient here, and I think goes to the question of what constitutes the public, maybe within the public code. And it's from Erica Milliken, who writes, I love the biological metaphor. Extending from it, consider that biological systems have regulators at every turn. Protein is overproduced, a regulator molecule provides feedback, protein production is adjusted until the loop is corrected. Where this feedback loop does not correct, it becomes cancerous. Okay. In the software industry, there are no regulatory industries that approve new software and impose penalties outside of Europe. I'm not sure this is true, in the sense that Russia and China probably provide more, some more problematic counterexamples to that point. How would you say that this lack of regulation impacts the entirety of the software ecosystem? And so maybe the question also to sort of piggyback on this is the question of regulation within the way in which the system itself might becomes self-regulating in this biological sense, the way in which the role of states have a supervisory function to regulate, to make regular these kinds of processes. And to a certain extent, this goes to the different valences of internet sovereignty that I described, where you have both European digital data privacy rights activists using this term, and also authoritarian regimes all over the world using it as a way to ensure that their particular capacity to organize remains unchallenged. So I wonder where you see the role of regulation, regularization to regulate within this ecosystem.
Well, I mean, first of all, I really love that the presentations that came before, they really set up a bunch of sort of things to draw from. But certainly, if you look at what the description of technology itself in the first presentation, was basically regulation and technology are quite similar activities in the sense that they are constraints in the possibility space, in the decision space that are constructed. And so one of the things that's really interesting about some of the work that we're doing is that, a lot of in open source development, for instance, there are these checks that you have to go through in continuous integration, which is the process that many of the large web service companies use to make their software, which is where thousands of people are simultaneously contributing, and each time they make an addition to the code base, it goes through this process of integration. And that integration process has a bunch of tests in it. And a lot of those tests are computational tests. Does it do all the things that it claims it's going to do? But there are now lots of different other kinds of testing that fit into this process. And some of that testing functions essentially as regulation. And so one of the things that's really interesting about that is that, if you have the idea of unit testing, which is testing the smallest supposition that goes into your argumentation, but as it enters the argumentation, then you don't end up like the idea that you even approach things like monopolistic practices is very hard to get there, because the assumptions that you're basing that on are already regulated out of play. And so the question is, though, for the giants that already exist, I think one of the things that we're going to start to find really interesting is that the other word, so there's two words, stewardship is the active form of this kind of maintenance, right? Maintenance is a thing. Of the two words, I think they're going to become the most important words in the 21st century are maintenance and adaptivity, right? And I think that maintenance is something that no thing in capitalism wants to do unless it has a monopoly, because it is very costly and doesn't have this kind of hockey stick of a return at the front end of it. So as we move, this is one of the things about technology turning into infrastructure, is that infrastructure is as expensive as fuck, and it doesn't really produce a whole bunch of profit a lot of the time. And so you see this all the time in the negotiation between the rail and all these other things, is like, now we made this thing that extracted a whole bunch of value, and now it's a hot potato that no one wants to have to deal with. And so we're coming to a moment now where there is going to be regulatory pressure on Google and Facebook and some of these companies, and it may be that the answer for them is not like it was back in the Baby Bell era, where when you were trying to break up a monopoly, you just made it into tiny companies. Turns out that actually doesn't do very much, but instead maybe what happens is that you open the platforms that these companies are built on. And so like, if they're no longer extracting value out of it, they can say, okay, maybe this doesn't actually make sense for us financially anymore, but we do want it to exist because all of our higher level products operate in that context. And so if basically they want to bank that into the public layer. And so if you turn software from being a private monopoly into just a public open infrastructure, then the companies that were taking advantage of that already can continue to do that, but they now level the playing field for a lot of other actors that want to start operating in that space. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to that question, but the point being that I think regulation is, interestingly, the other thing I was talking about before is game design, right? And regulation is also like game design, because you're giving the actors like a choice space in which they can play, right? And so, in some ways, if you can convince these companies that what you're doing is being the game designer for their activity on top of a newly public platform that does many of the basic things that they were hoping to do, maintain a social graph, have a semantic graph about the world, these types of things, those are going to be some of the largest publicly created ontological objects, that is like the biggest barn raising ever, right? And that at some point the corporate actors will realize that it's like not something that they actually want to have to deal with anymore, and they'll send it into the arms of the taxpayer, as the Americans like to say.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben, for that, and thank you very much for your participation. I'm glad that the project set it up for you. I thought that might be the case.